Good afternoon and welcome to Casa Navarro's webinar. Bienvenidos. My name is Georgia Ruiz Davis and I'm the site manager at Casa Navarro. As many of you know, Casa Navarro is the 1850s home of Jose Antonio Navarro, a Texas patriot and statesman. You can go to our website to find out more about us and about Navarro, and that address is visitcasanavarro.com. Just a few things before I turn the program over to our guest. In case you didn't already know, Casa Navarro is temporarily closed because of the demolition of the big ugly building just to the north of us. I'm told that we will hopefully be able to move back into the Casa by the end of the year, so we're looking forward to that. In the meantime, tune in for our next webinar on Thursday, October 29th from noon to 1 p.m. with Art Martinez de Vara. Some of you may remember him as our guest on the very first webinar that we did back in July. He's the author of the biography of Jose Francisco Ruiz, Navarro's uncle. Our next webinar event is called Actual, Factual, Creepy San Antonio. So Martinez de Vara will tell us all about several weird and wonderful happenings throughout the history of SA and the surrounding communities. So you won't want to miss that. So today, we are very happy and very honored to have with us Dr. Andrés Reséndez. He grew up in Mexico City. After earning a BA in International Relations from El Colegio de Mexico, he worked in various capacities, but says that the best job he had during this period of time was as a historical consultant for telenovelas, which I think we need to ask him about later. He received his PhD in history at the University of Chicago. He taught at Yale University and the University of Helsinki before becoming faculty at the University of California, Davis, where he currently teaches courses on Latin America and Mexico. Among his many honors, he was a finalist for the National Book Award and a winner of the Bancroft Prize, which is one of the most prestigious awards in the field of American history writing. Both of those accolades were for his 2016 book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. But today, Dr. Reséndez is going to be talking to us about his 2007 book, A Land So Strange, the epic journey of Cabeza de Vaca, the extraordinary tale of a shipwrecked Spaniard who walked across America in the 16th century. This book is extraordinary in its own right, combining perceptive scholarship and a wonderfully written narrative that brings to life the story of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who arrived in Texas in 1528 and spent 8 years living among the Native Americans. Dr. Reséndez's book is regarded by many, including myself, as the best account ever of Cabeza de Vaca and his extraordinary adventures. So, Dr. Reséndez, please take us on a journey. And I'm going to hand the reins over to you.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Georgia. And let me just navigate this, show my screen. And then I trust that you are able to see my slides now.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so again, thank you so much. A pleasure, and let's dive into it. And in fact, what you will discover is that my 2016 book, The Other Slavery, comes out naturally, organically from this previous book project that says volumes about Indian slavery. But anyways, this is about an expedition, a Spanish expedition in the 1520s and 1530s, the Florida expedition. Sometimes it's also known as the Narvaez expedition or the expedition of Cabeza de Vaca. But I wanted to say something about the beginnings of this expedition and the aims of this expedition before we get into the action, just because I think there's an opportunity here to go beyond some of our very crystallized but very wrong ideas about these early settlers, early conquistadors, missionaries, and what they were seeking to do in in the Americas. So first of all, I will say that typically we call it the Spanish expeditions, but really Spain at the time was an empire spanning half of Europe. So it was not just Spaniards that went on these expeditions, but which is something that I was vaguely aware before I started researching this book, but it struck me as I got more into the details, just how many people from Italy, from Germany, from the northern Africa, and elsewhere, and even within Spain. Spain was really an agglomeration of different kingdoms, and some of these differences remain until today. But in the 16th century, they were even more pronounced than they are today. So really, we say Spaniards, but in fact, we are really talking about a much larger contingent of people, all of whom went to the city of Seville, a very cosmopolitan, very fast-growing city in the 16th century, which is where our story began. So here's a little look at the larger, of course, Spain was this worldwide empire, and so even others from beyond Europe were also a part of this expedition. So the second point that I wanted to make in connection with those early expeditions is that we typically think of them as very male-dominated expeditions, but in fact, in most of them, there were women. I mean, what I'm showing you here is a painting of a nun who famously escaped and cross-dressed as a man, and then had all these adventures in the New World. But even not considering these cases, women were a significant part of the early voyages of exploration and settlement of the New World. In the case of the expedition that we are talking about, there were 300 individuals, and 10 of them were women. We look at the licenses. Before you could come from Spain to the New World, you had to register, and so we have some of those. You had to get a license by the Spanish crown, and so we have records of those licenses. And we can see that in some years, there were up to 20–30% of those early settlers, those early voyagers, were actually women. Many of them were women who were married to the officers and other men of these expeditions, but many others were single, unattached women who came to the New World because it made perfect sense for them. Spain was a very female, because of all the number of males who were coming to the New World, there was an overabundance of females in New Spain. In Old Spain. Whereas in the New World, you would have exactly the opposite situation. You had a very male, Spanish male presence, many of whom had been able to carve out domains, had property, had Indian slaves, were able to derive rents from some of the resources that they were able to find in the New World, and all they needed to complete their happiness was a good Spanish woman. So it made sense for women from Spain to come to the New World. It made perfect sense. And the third point was that we often think and talk about them as conquistadors and as soldiers. And in many representations, so this is a 17th century painting of the moment where Cortés met Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs in central Mexico. Typically the Spaniards are depicted in full armor, riding horses. And the sense that you get is that they were soldiers. But in fact, many of these early expeditions, especially the earliest expeditions of discovery, were really a cross-section of Spanish society. They, very few of them, relatively few, had actually any formal training as soldiers, but many of them were artisans, doctors, many of them were peasants, and it made sense to enlist for a venture like this one a range of skills that would be needed in the settlement of the New World. So really, you wanted everything in your expedition, and this is exactly what we got in the early expedition. So this is exactly what we got in the expedition that I'm going to be talking about briefly very soon. The only sector that was initially prohibited from going were, well, there were other peoples for religious reasons, etc., who were barred from coming to the New World, but the only profession that was explicitly barred were lawyers. They didn't want any lawyers in the New World. Again, did not succeed. Many lawyers also made it to the New World. And finally, and the last point before we actually go into, this is an image of Seville, which was really a marvel in the 16th century. It was the beginning and the end of many of these expeditions. Seville was the only port in the Spanish realms that was licensed to do business with the New World. And so as a result of that, the number of ships and ventures that were outfitted there ballooned. So you can see Seville is not actually on the coast, but it is up the Guadalquivir River, about a day's sail away from the coast, in a very treacherous, very silted, and increasingly difficult to navigate river. But nonetheless, it was a very substantial city that could provide settlers and all kinds of individuals for any voyages of exploration. It had also a long-standing maritime tradition. It had all the carpenters, caulkers, and all the other artisans that were required for outfitting these expeditions. It had lots of food that it imported from its own hinterland as well as from farther afield in order to supply the vessels. Now, typically, if you have any image of these early expeditions, is that they were organized by the crown, and very few of them actually were organized by the crown. Mostly they were private enterprises. So entrepreneurial individuals would raise funds, would charter or buy ships, would supply them with everything that was needed, would recruit the individuals, and it would then seek the blessing of the Spanish crown in order to proceed with these expeditions to the New World. So the crown, basically what it did was to lay out exactly the area that these expeditions would go to, and this was done in order to prevent fights between different entrepreneurs, so that you did not encroach on somebody else's area of exploration and settlement. And in return for this, the crown would get a cut of all the proceeds that would be found in these expeditions. And to that effect, the crown would actually dispatch its own officials in these expeditions to make sure that the Spanish crown got its own cut of the proceeds. Okay, so enough for the setting up of this expedition. This was an expedition that was organized in Seville, stopped at the Canary Islands, as many of these transatlantic expeditions did, in order to top off provisions and water before they made it into the Caribbean, especially the first and the largest island possession of the Spanish in the New World, which was Hispaniola, or La Isla Española, which already the name in Spanish tells you that this was the one speck in the entire continent first controlled by the Spanish, to further supply the ships, get ready, and then move into the target area, which was what they thought was Florida. So that's why it was called the Florida expedition. Basically, as I was saying, the limits of these patent of conquest that Pánfilo de Narváez, as the leader of this expedition was called, received was to go north from somebody else's patent. I don't know if you can see can you see my arrow? I hope you can. Anyways, so you can see that there are these lands of Nuño de Guzmán. So
I can see it.
Okay, good. Thank you. The Pánfilo de Narváez lands would go to the north and as far as the end of the of what is now the peninsula of Florida. So clearly an enormous settlement area, which turned out to be about 4 times as large as Spain proper. So you know, an expedition of 300 individuals would be nothing to the, you know, compared to the enormity of this enterprise. But at the time, in the 1520s, the Spanish monarchy and Spaniards in general knew very little about the actual geography of the New World, knew very little about what lay on the Pacific side of the Americas. You know, so they did the best with the limited information that they could, and they obviously overdid it in this case. So this expedition, just to cut to the chase, turned into an unmitigated disaster because of the 300 men who started out. Only 4 ended up surviving, 3 Spaniards in commanding positions and 1 African slave. And they spent, as Georgia was saying, almost a decade living amongst various indigenous societies in and around Florida, but the bulk of that time was spent in what is now the coast of Texas, as we shall see in a minute. The expedition was marred by all kinds of problems from the beginning. So first of all, they experienced a hurricane in the southern coast of Cuba. Hurricanes were a complete novelty for Spaniards of the early 16th century. Hurricanes require, as you know, very well required a lot of heat to form and the right conditions. And so people living in the northern Atlantic region, like Spaniards and others, had never seen a hurricane. So they, the fact that they experienced this incredible meteorological phenomenon really made a big impression on them and made them believe that perhaps there was some omen that they should not be doing this, or that this would end up pretty badly. But perhaps the worst setbacks for the expedition were 2 man-made errors. The first one was navigational. And again, I don't know if some of you have sailed ever, but you can imagine very well that navigational technology in the 16th century was a far cry from what it is today. They did not have GPSs. And indeed, all of these Spaniards were dealing with the elements of the New World for the first time, and in particular, the very powerful current called the Gulf Stream that circles around the Gulf of Mexico that I'm sure most of you, many of you, or all of you are very familiar with. At the time, in the 1520s, there was only really 1 pilot that was more or less familiar with just the strength of this current. And other pilots coming from who had trained in the Mediterranean or elsewhere in Europe would be at a loss to understand just the sheer strength and what it would do to voyages in the New World. So in any case, the plan for this expedition was to go from the north coast, as I can point with from the north coast of Cuba to slightly north of what they called the Rio de las Palmas. This river, this famous Rio de las Palmas, which is what is now the present-day river of Soto la Marina in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, just south of Texas, was the dividing line between the grant given to Núñez de Guzmán and the grant given to Pánfilo de Narváez. And so they wanted to start there because it was closest to the only available European settlement in that entire region, which was Santiesteban del Puerto, that you can see here, established in 1523. So just recently established before. And so the Narváez settlers and pilots wanted to go there. So theoretically, it would have been a straight east to west shot. but of course the current intervened. And instead of going this way, oh God, I can't get the, okay, here we go. Instead of going along the intended path, they ran into contrary and very powerful contrary currents, and they ended up veering off course badly and ended up making landfall somewhere in Tampa Bay. Now, well, I mean, I could address this in the questions and answer. I can tell you a lot more about how it is possible that you ended up thousands of miles away from your intended target. And the reason is that you would have spent weeks going against the current. If you're in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico with no land references, you would think that you were sailing sufficiently long so as to cross the entire Gulf of Mexico, when in fact, because the contrary currents, you were pretty much staying in place and drifting off course. And so this is how these terrible navigational mistake would have occurred. So suffice it to say that the expeditionaries thought they had arrived close to the Rio de las Palmas. They also thought that they were slightly to the north of the Rio de las Palmas. Again, this is a classic navigational technique that if you don't know a little bit about navigation, you don't understand the story. Typically, if you were going to say from Havana didn't exist at the moment, but if you were going to Havana to the Rio de las Palmas, you would actually not point your compass straight into the Rio de las Palmas or the mouth of the Rio de las Palmas, because you wouldn't know whether you would have arrived to the north or to the south of the Rio de las Palmas. So in order to be certain in your navigation, you would aim off. This is the strategy. So you would aim off, in this case, to the north of the Rio de las Palmas. And so that way, you knew that you would land it somewhere to the north of your intended target. And then once you hit the coast, you would then turn south and you would finally end at the place where you wanted to go. So they aimed off to the north. And so that means that upon reaching the coast, you would then start going to the left. And this is exactly what happened. They landed on Tampa Bay. They were pretty confident, or they were not confident, but they were uncertain about exactly where they arrived, but they thought that they were relatively close to the Rio de las Palmas. And then the commander of the expedition, Pánfilo de Narváez, made the tragic mistake of dividing the ships, getting all the men ashore, and dividing the expedition into two. A land party, the overwhelming majority of the expeditionaries, the horses, etc., and then the rest would remain in the ships, and they would continue coasting, and the land party and the maritime party would reunite at the mouth of the Rio de las Palmas, as was the plan. But of course, they were never able to reunite. They were tragically off course. The people on the ships very quickly realized that they were nowhere near the Rio de las Palmas. In the meantime, the land party went into, into Florida, and ended up becoming stranded in the New World, with the closest European settlement being thousands of miles away from where they were. So they eventually emerged in what is now the Florida Panhandle, in the so-called Bay of Horses. They call it that because that's where they decided on a new strategy. They would kill and eat their horses. They would melt their spurs and every object of metal of steel that they had, and they would chop down some trees. This is the type of vegetation that exists over there. So you get a sense of what they were up to, and they would fashion 5 barges out of these, lashed together with the manes of the horses. Well, they actually wove some rope with the manes of the horses. They made water bottles with the legs of the horses, I mean, they were clearly very resourceful individuals. Again, these were not gold-crazed conquistadors. They were pretty resourceful individuals who were able to do this. From there, they launched on these 5 rafts, eventually crossing the Mississippi River. We know that because they pointedly tell us that they, they always, since they no longer had weapons, they were pretty much naked and at the elements, they started fearing the indigenous peoples of the coast of what is now Alabama, Mississippi, etc. And every time they needed to stop in order to get water, to replenish their water, it was taking their lives in their hands. So when they crossed the Mississippi, they thought it was such a luxury that they were able to replenish their, the discharge of the Mississippi River was so enormous that they were able to get fresh water even while navigating in the Gulf of Mexico. And however, these enormous discharge put the 5 rafts deep into the Gulf of Mexico, deeper than they wanted to be. There's only so much maneuverability that you have with these barges with very improvised sails. And so they had a difficult time trying to continue to hug the coast. And eventually all 5, remarkably, all 5 of them ended up washing up on what is now the coast of Texas. This I will go over. So here's a closer view of the probable landing locations of these 5 barges. Again, there is, if you look at the specialized literature, you will see that there are some discussions about exactly where they may have been that will probably be remain alive for a long time unless we find some indisputable archaeological evidence, because really all we have are some vague geographic references to try to reconstruct this story, which makes it fun, but also makes it not less than certain. Suffice it to say that out of these 300 individuals, only 4 ended up surviving. What's remarkable, and that's why I said this book led me to the next one, The Other Slavery, is that they found themselves at the mercy of the Native Americans who lived on the coast of Texas in the early 16th century. So again, there are many groups that are mentioned by the expeditionaries, of the Narvaez expeditionaries. Many of those groups cannot be directly matched with indigenous groups that were later known to live, for example, in the 17th or 18th century in the coast of Texas. So exactly the enormous turmoil that happened between the 16th and the 17th century is something of a little bit of a mystery still. But the lifestyle was kind of remarkable and was quite fascinating. These were nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who spent the year alternating between the islands of the coast of Texas and the mainland. So at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, they were living in the islands and where they remained for the winter, and they took advantage of some of the food resources available at the time, eating oysters, for example, fishing, etc. And eventually they would make their way into the mainland, especially during the spring, and then they would take advantage of additional resources, food resources available to them in the form of berries, in the form of buffaloes, which I will show you later. One of the really fascinating aspects is that these 4 survivors, these 3 Spaniards and this African slave, were enslaved by the natives of the region. But the type of slavery is fascinating because they were, we have evidence that these 4 individuals actually begged to join some of these bands. So these were reluctant slavers in the sense that It was a complicated calculus for them because these were additional mouths to feed at a time of the year in the late fall and early winter where there would be a premium for provision. So they were more like tolerated in the camp like stray dogs rather than what we imagine typically as formal slavery. Nonetheless, at least three of these individuals were enslaved eventually in the more formal sense, meaning that they were not able to leave the places of their masters. They were attached to certain families or certain individuals. They were compelled to do hard work, and they were mistreated. So in other words, all the hallmarks of slavery, and that's, as I said, what triggered my greater interest in this topic of indigenous slaveries later on. It is also very interesting if you have any interest whatsoever in plants and animals of southern Texas and northern Mexico, to hear about the different things that they fed on and they survived on, especially these prickly pears. That was a major source of food for many groups in the region. I have one planted in my backyard, which dates back to the writing of this book, and we eat them in Mexico quite commonly, and it is again a very hardy and very nutritious plant. They also are the first Europeans to describe buffalo, and we have some of the early drawings of these phenomenal animal that, of course, was completely unknown in Europe. And eventually, what's really the most puzzling aspect of this expedition, and I want to conclude pretty quickly here, I want to leave enough time for questions or comments or whatever, is that even though these four individuals eventually were able to extricate themselves from these conditions of enslavement, they were able to do that by becoming medicine men. At first they were the indigenous peoples forced them to perform these healings. The four individuals themselves were very skeptical, but they complied because otherwise they would not be fed. And eventually they apparently had some success, according to the two main documentary sources that we have of this expedition. And the natives came to regard them as very powerful men. So in some of the medical beliefs of the Native Americans of the region, and Native Americans more broadly, they did not conceive of a very strict difference between the natural and the supernatural world. And they also believed that certain individuals had extraordinary gifts in their ability to manipulate these natural and supernatural world, shamans or medicine men or whatever you want to call them. And it is not entirely surprising that they would regard these very strange looking individuals who obviously came from an imaginably distant place, that perhaps they had some of these powers to help them heal some of their ill. So it is not surprising that natives would make them perform these healing ceremonies. On the other hand, the Europeans themselves also, of course, believed in miracles, and in fact came to believe that their lives had been spared. Out of 300, only 4 survivors, and perhaps God had a higher purpose for them. And so they came to believe, and they say so, they became the instruments of God. And so they, again, had a way to explain these healings. So exactly what the explanation is very hard to tell at a distance of 500 years. One of them we know was the son of a physician in Spain, and from the descriptions they make of the healings, some of them were actually pretty able medical interventions. So clearly there was some knowledge of medicine that kind of explains this. But more generally, you can choose alternative explanations about what happened. But the point is that the 4 survivors, those went from being slaves to becoming really powerful healers who were passed from one group to another, and they were able to go wherever their host would take them. And even though they came close to the Santi Esteban del Puerto, which is right here. So here, this is Texas, the great sand belt, Rio Grande right here. Santi Esteban del Puerto was just a couple of 100 miles to the south of where they were. Even so, and here's they are feeding on these prickly pears. There's a second ground of prickly pears. Even though they could have gone straight into the Spanish-controlled territory, at some point, these 4 survivors decided that they wanted to go along with their hosts. At that point, all their needs were being satisfied by scores of eager Native Americans who were, as I said, passing them on from one group to another. And so they became explorers once again, but very extraordinary explorers, in that they were really sponsored by Native Americans living in the region. So this is a painting that exists in a medical center in Galveston Island, representing one of these instances in which Cabeza de Vaca is extracting an arrowhead from a man, which again, a very idealized view. I mean, there's like a bed and everything, which unlikely that would have been the case. But again, it gives you a sense of the enduring legacy of these expeditions. So again, the reconstruction of the route is still something that remains totally agreed upon by all scholars in the field. But the dominant view now is that it actually went from Texas into what is now northeastern Mexico, into the state of Tamaulipas, into the state of Coahuila, skirting the Rio Grande, and eventually reaching what is now La Junta de los Ríos. And ultimately, these 4 survivors were able to cross all the way to the Pacific side, amazing as it may sound, in a momentous walk. These were the very first outsiders who were able to see deep into the interior of North America. And so their writings, these 2 accounts, these 2 documentary sources, are really extremely valuable because we get an unvarnished view of life at the time, at that early time. We also, by contrast, we also see this was the first contact of many of these indigenous groups living in the interior of North America with anyone beyond the Americas. So you can imagine what a startling sight must have been these 3 white men and this black man, Estebanico, the former African slave, walking at the head or in the midst of hundreds and sometimes thousands of indigenous hosts that were taking them and feeding them and tending to their every needs. The end of the story, just to wrap things up, was again another eye-opening encounter with Nuño de Guzman. Remember, we've encountered him before. He was the owner of the grant that was just to the south of Narvaez by the Rio de las Palmas. Nuño de Guzman had gone on to Mexico City, where he became an important figure, president of the Audiencia of Mexico, and eventually was given command of another expedition to explore what is now the northwest of Mexico. And Nuño de Guzman was departed from Mexico City, was a very ruthless conquistador that really fits the mold that we have of the pretty ruthless conquistador, whose one of the principal businesses was exactly the enslaving of Indians all around this region. And so the final encounter, of course, that occurred in what is now the vicinity of Culiacan, was a showdown between these men working for Nuño de Guzman. This was a cavalry detachment that was in the business of rounding up men, women, and children. And they spotted these survivors who were coming with hundreds of natives. And so immediately they wanted to enslave those natives, and even doubted at first who these 4 individuals were, these 3 white men and these black men that were emerging from the depths of North America, and must have been a completely bizarre apparition where they least expected to find such people. So, so that was the end of that expedition. I will finish this brief presentation by saying that this expedition really is interesting for many different reasons that we can talk about. But one of the most interesting ones is that even that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, by virtue of having to deal with Native America in its own terms, without the benefit of powerful firearms or horses, etc., they were able to understand at a deeper level these societies that they were living with. And so when Cabeza de Vaca in particular went back to Spain, he proposed to go back and to receive a grant of colonization in the lands where he had explored. And his idea was to form a partnership with these indigenous groups that he had already come in contact with. So in some ways, this was a fork in the road where a different kind of conquest could have occurred. And it is really telling that by the time Cabeza de Vaca made it back to Spain and requested this, that patent of conquest and exploration had been given to De Soto, another fairly ruthless conquistador. So it gives you a sense of the ruthless dealing and willing that was taking place at the time in the 1530s. So anyways, so I want to leave it here and open up for questions and comments. I will change the presenter and will. So do you have the?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes. So, I wanted to ask you something, in your opinion, do you think, well, in your opinion, do you think that he became a sincere defender of Native American humanity? And it sounds like yes, especially from your last comments. Mm-hmm. Is that what you think? I mean, do you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that there was a significant sector within the Spanish Empire that wanted reform, that recognized the tremendous atrocities that had been committed on Native Americans in the 1520s and early 1530s, and they wanted reform. So much so that eventually this actually culminated in a new compact between Spain and the New World called the New Laws in 1542. So Cabeza de Vaca was part of that broader movement. So I do believe that there were some clear-eyed Spaniards who realized that this is contrary, even in the interest, even if you, so many Native Americans were dying because of this, that even if you just wanted to profit from Native Americans, this was not working out because they were dying off, and if you wanted to exploit them, you would need to preserve them in some ways. So I think Cabeza de Vaca is part of a real agent or movement that existed within the Spanish Empire. We also have a little bit of tidbit in particular about Cabeza de Vaca from where he eventually was dispatched to South America. So he got his wish. So I said that De Soto had already taken the commission that he wanted, but he got a commission to South America, and he was shipped back by the conquistadors there because he would remove his boots and wanted to walk barefoot, and he prohibited his soldiers from trading with the natives, etc. So clearly there were a few aspects of his experience, previous experience in the New World, that that really made a deep impression on him.
No, that's good to. Thank you. I think Kristen, we also have Kristen Rodriguez
Yes.
on line. We've got a couple questions or maybe a comment. Go ahead.
Yes, we do. This Miss O'Neill would like to thank you for the great presentation, and she does have one question. By any chance, is there a list of the 30% of females that joined the expedition?
Well, I mean, as I said, in this particular expedition, there are only 10 women. They are mentioned, but not by name. They are, you know, they mentioned the 10 women in this particular expedition. In the what I meant that in some, so what we have are the ship manifests. So they are called the Pasajeros de India. So they are the licenses for settlers going from Spain to the New World. And there were, I don't know, 200 ships that went from, say, you know, 1492 to 1520 or something. So you can actually consult the list of passengers. And in some cases, that percentage goes up to 30%, as you're saying, or even higher in some particular ships. And that there you would find the specific names of the people going there to which the licenses were granted. So yeah, you can find the names of the people.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. I wanted to ask you something. And this is kind of sensationalistic, but so, you know, the Karankawas had that reputation, and I think a lot of people still hold on to this. The Karankawas had a reputation as being cannibals. And obviously that could have been a ceremonial thing or whatever, but then Cabeza de Vaca says that about the Karankawa, that they love their children more than any other people I've seen. So what in your research or in what you've read about or found out about that part of his trip can you talk about?
Well, I mean, as far as that expedition itself, as I said, we are reduced to these two documents. And
Right.
As I said, there are many different individual groups that are mentioned that cannot be matched, that you assume that they must be the forerunners to the Karankawa natives later on, but you cannot, because the names are different.
Oh, sure.
But you can assume that the way of life of the Karankawa Indians in the 18th century or 19th century would be not too different from these earlier groups in the 16th century. But more broadly, I can say this, which is, first of all, human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism were real in the New World, as indeed in many other parts of the world. So this existed. This has been well documented in various parts of the Caribbean, in various parts of the mainland, in French and English and Spanish sources, in archaeological discoveries. So there's no question that this existed. Having this was a practice. Having said that, so I cannot say in regards to the Karankawas whether they did that, but other groups did it. But what I also can tell you is that Indian slavery played a role into this, because Indian slavery was usually forbidden except in some extraordinary circumstances. And cannibals, so indigenous peoples who were cannibalistic, could be legally enslaved. The thought being that cannibalism was such a terrible sin that only extraordinary measure like enslavement would actually be justified. And so what we have is also many records from the 1520s and 30s and 40s that sensationalized and exaggerated the instances of cannibalism, because it made sense in terms of justification for Indian slavery that went on all over the Caribbean region during this time, and all over the Gulf of Mexico as well.
Sure.
So that's sort of a general.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I think,
Okay.
Kristen, we have another.
Yes, we have a couple more questions that have come in. So thank you guys for submitting those. This is from Elizabeth. Did Cabeza de Vaca experience with Native Americans in any way influence Spanish use of the mission system?
No. By the time Cabeza de Vaca arrived in the New World, there were already missionaries in the New World. And in fact, the missionary system was a given because of the legal way in which Spain came to acquire the New World. So basically, the legality, the legal justification was that the Pope granted temporal dominion over the New World to the Spanish crown in exchange for Christianizing the peoples of the New World. And so missionization was a necessary step for this to occur. So this would have occurred with Cabeza de Vaca or without Cabeza de Vaca. So this is something that would have gone beyond him. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And this next question is from Patience. Is there any evidence that other survivors of the expedition ended up living with the Indians rather than dying?
Yes. Well, first of all, I said that out of 300, only 4 survived. That is generally the line, but we don't know in a few cases if there were others. I mean, the only thing I can tell you is that these 4 did not come in contact with them. These 4 actually detail many deaths. Many died with encounters with Indians or were overworked, exploited by natives who took them as prisoners. In many cases, it was sheer exposure and lack of food. As I said, they arrived in the fall and the winter. Surviving that first winter was just absolutely formidable and very difficult for many of them. But it is possible that some others may have survived beyond these 4 that we just simply don't know about, and they don't appear in the 2 main documentary sources. We have cases elsewhere in the Americas of people who went completely native, Europeans who went completely native and took up indigenous women and had families, and then actually sometimes refused to get back into the Spanish world. So we have some of that as well, and there's no reason to believe that this did not also occur in the course of the Florida expedition. So that's a good question.
Thank you. Okay, this next question is from Brian. I know the Spanish were diligent about recording their experiences in the New World, but how is it that we know so much from Cabeza de Vaca's journey as he traversed Texas and northern Mexico? When and how did he record his journeys?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, we have 2 main documentary sources, as I have mentioned over and over. One of them was what is normally known as the joint report. And that is at the end of this 8-year ordeal, when the 3 surviving Spaniards and the African Estebanico arrived into Spanish-controlled territory, they were fully debriefed by the Spanish authorities. And these joint reports, so basically, if you can gather who of the 4 is speaking in some of these journeys, because their stories were a little different. All 4 of them were not together in several during years of their captivity in the coast of Texas, and so you can figure out who is really recounting his experience at each section of the joint report. What is really striking is that that report really reflects the experiences of the 3 Spaniards and not the African man, who in some ways would have been the far more interesting to interview, because of course he had been a slave in Africa, a slave in Europe, and now a slave to the indigenous peoples in the New World. And so his perspective would have been fascinating just from the standpoint of comparative slaveries, number one. But number two, the way they put it is that the three Spaniards held back, and the one who actually did the interaction, the bulk of the interaction with the indigenous peoples, was the African man, Estebanico, who apparently was very gifted in learning new languages. And so if anyone knew the most about what went on and the interactions with different groups, it would have been Estebanico. So anyway, so that's one source, and that's why we know so much about it. The second was an account published by Cabeza de Vaca, the highest ranking member of this failed expedition, that was published in 1552. And he, again, this is a first person account that is very detailed. It mostly coincides with the joint reports, except in a few minor details, which are themselves quite interesting. So you are right. You are right in that this is typically would not have known that much about a failed expedition like that if not for these two extraordinarily lengthy, detailed, and very enlightening sources that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And we have one last question, and this is from A. Rodriguez. Are there records that indicate he, I'm assuming Cabeza de Vaca, had children with the Native Americans?
That is a fascinating question. We know that there is evidence that all four of them had contact with Native women. There are indications that they may have and probably did have contact with Native women. After all, these, after they became powerful medicine men, these very strangers would have become very appealing. We also know that Estebanico, all four made it to Mexico City, and the viceroy in Mexico City wanted to use their knowledge and enlisted the African slave Estebanico in a follow-up expedition to the north. And when he went in this later expedition as a guide, we know that he was requesting women from some of the indigenous peoples that he fell in with. So that already tells you a little bit about maybe the type of interactions that existed, during 80 years of these four men being in the New World. There is no formal declaration on the part of Cabeza de Vaca or the joint report about intimate contact with Native women, in part because they didn't want to get in trouble. They were married, and this would have been bigamy or worse. And this text that Cabeza de Vaca published was, at the time, specifically reviewed by the Spanish Inquisition. So the last thing you wanted to do was to get in trouble by detailing some of those encounters that probably existed, but we have very little to go on, really.
Thank you for that. Great questions. Those are really great questions. Dr. Reséndez, we have Mr. Vaca from Anne Frank Elementary School in Dallas wants to, let's see, he says, thank you, Dr. Reséndez, for your presentation. Could you send a special salute in Spanish to our kindergarten class?
Claro que sí, con muchísimo gusto. Espero que les haya interesado la historia que les conté. Que estén muy bien, les deseo lo mejor. Un abrazo.
That's great, thank you. And I have let's see, I wanted to talk to you to just get you, I know we're running out of time, just to get you a little bit of information from you about the book. So in interest to the people who follow us because of Jose Antonio Navarro, because of the place where we work and that we run, I wanted to ask you how you got interested in, so this is one of the three books that I have. You've authored other books, but A Texas Patriot on Trial in Mexico, Jose Antonio Navarro, and the Texas Santa Fe Expedition. So here's like another kind of failed expedition that there's a theme, but how did you become interested in that, or what sparked your interest in starting to research Navarro?
Well, that was my very first work, which you're seeing there on your screen, Changing National Identities on the Frontier, Texas and New Mexico,
Okay.
which was all about, well, in the case of Texas, all about these rebellions and expeditions, failed and otherwise, that unfolded between the 1820s and the 1840s in the years leading up to the war between Mexico and the US in 1846, 48. So I found, I fell in love with the idea that Texas would launch this expedition to claim half of New Mexico as its territory. And I found quite fascinating that this expedition again turned into a disaster. People surrendered, arriving in Santa Fe.
Right.
And that some of the survivors of that expedition were marched all the way to Mexico City.
Right.
And that they would try Navarro for treason. So because the topic of was about loyalties and identities, here you have a very rare case of a Texas patriot who had become involved in this hard-brained expedition, who was suddenly confronted by Mexicans who assumed that he was a Mexican, and being otherwise, being a secessionist, was completely unpatriotic. And so the exchanges between these accusers in Mexico and Navarro I found quite fascinating.
Awesome. That's great. Kristen, I'll go ahead. We have someone who's asked a follow-up question, actually back to Cabeza de Vaca. Do you think that he may have embellished his experiences?
Of course.
No, sir.
I mean, there's no get around the fact that, especially the Cabeza de Vaca published, this is a very public script that was designed to curry favor with the Spanish monarchy. So obviously this is embellished. And it is very highly scripted. One of the things that I'm very tickled by is the fact that Cabeza de Vaca describes all these seemingly miraculous curings. I mean, he revived one man who appeared to be dead. He cured many others, and then he drops this line that, and of all the Indians that came to me, all of them said that they were well and that it was incredible. However, he very studiously avoided the word miracle, because again, this would have been problematic with the Inquisition. So he describes all of these things, but obviously is playing an ulterior game of trying to curry favor with the Spanish monarchy, but within the confines. I mean, considering that this is a very highly scripted text, we get a lot of detail that jives perfectly well with what we know about the archaeology and the ways of natives in the New World.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I think I have more questions, but we need to cut it off now. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think our viewers, it looks like we held everybody till the very end for the most part. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Great.
Good luck with your great work, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all. And thank you all for tuning in. See you next time.
Bye.
Okay, bye.